Thank you very much for joining a special event for Dr. Al-Hoorie. It's been a pleasure for us to invite him to Osaka University. Ali, thank you very much for accepting our offer. And then today, over 120 people registered to this event. So thank you very much for joining in this event. So before this talk, I'd like to make an announcement, one thing. And then as I said, we are going to record the event, but it will be only his talk, not Q&A sessions. And if you wish not to appear in the recording, please choose a hide self-view on Zoom. And then he's going to upload the talk to his YouTube channel and then post it on his homepage later. So now I'd like to introduce him a little bit. He received his PhD from University of Nottingham from Professor Zoltan Dornier, and now he works at Saudi TESOL Association. And in his career, he published many books and book chapters and journal articles and presenting himself at international conferences. So he is an outstanding researcher in the field. And then now I'd like to welcome Dr. Al-Hoorie.
Thank you very much for inviting me. Let me just make this screen. And I'm going to turn off the camera. Okay, thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to present this talk today about language engagement, a metamotivational perspective. So we will talk about, these issues in this talk. But before that, let's have a look at this quotation. Although the terms teaching and learning are typically paired, those of us who teach know that students don't always learn. When I complained about this early in my teaching career, a colleague chided me, saying I taught students something they just didn't learn it. Is akin to saying I sold them the car, they just didn't buy it. So there is some similarity here between, it doesn't make sense to say I sold them the car. It's them who buy the car, not you who sell the car. It's a mutual activity. And teaching and learning are also so connected. So if there is teaching and there is no learning, then there is actually no teaching. We pretend to teach, but if learning doesn't take place, then there is actually no teaching. And we will see that in order for learning to take place, we need engagement. Without engagement, there is no learning and there is no actual teaching. So in this talk, I'm going to talk about engagement and the difference between engagement and motivation. Why are they different? Are they similar? I'm going to talk about how to measure engagement. I'm going to talk about direct, indirect, and unobtrusive types of measurement. Then I will talk about fake engagement. How, if engagement is not complete, we will see how we can understand fake engagement in relation to how our understanding is of engagement. And this is a big problem that many teachers suffer from, even though it is under-researched. So I'm going to overview an empirical study in this aspect. I'm going to talk about metamotivation, which is people's understanding of motivation. So after we researchers understand this whole thing, what do students and teachers who are not academics, what do they understand? Because it's their understanding that matters. No matter how sophisticated our understanding as a researcher of motivation, engagement, and fake engagement is, if students and teachers' understanding is different, it's their understanding that matters in the actual classroom, not our own understanding. So metamotivation studies how people understand motivation and, by extension, engagement. So we will have a look at it, and finally, I will end with some ways to engage motivation and engagement and remotivation in light of all this. So, what is the ideal classroom? If you ask a teacher about their ideal classroom, they will say, well, in the ideal classroom, students will participate with the teacher. They will ask questions. They will take notes of what the teacher says, of important points. They will not play with their phones, especially if it is not banned, if they have the choice whether to play with their phones or not. If they decide not to play with their phones, even though they could, then they are, this is an ideal classroom. They don't chat with their peers. This happens a lot about irrelevant things. We want them to talk about relevant things. We want to encourage this. It's not passively listening to the teacher. So these are the things that might come to the teacher's mind. And this is all behavioral manifestations of what students can do. But we can think of less obvious things that the teacher may not directly observe. And these are related to the cognitive aspects of motivation and engagement. Thinking, paying attention, not daydreaming. These are more tricky aspects of the classroom. How do you know that the student is cognitively engaged in your lesson? Just by looking at them and seeing that they are looking at you. They might be looking at you and not even talking or playing with their phones, but they may just be daydreaming. They may not be thinking of lunch or whatever things happening in their lives. You can't, you just indirectly infer through, again, kind of behavioral manifestations about their cognitive engagement. And again, emotional engagement, like enjoyment, enthusiasm, or anxiety, boredom, frustration, anger sometimes. Again, simply because the students are silent, they might be enjoying the lesson, they might be anxious, they might be bored, they might be frustrated. Silence is, there is some research on silence in the classroom. It's very hard to interpret for the teacher in real time what it means for students to be silent. They are silent and looking at you. What does this mean? They could be having fun and learning. They could be just bored. Let's look more. Let's look more about on boredom. So, what is boredom? There is a growing area of research on boredom, and boredom can have different aspects. Students could have indigenous boredom or reactive boredom. Indigenous boredom comes from the learner, from within the learner. They come to the classroom with this type of boredom, maybe because they don't like the subject, maybe because they are not interested in this. The class is in the wrong time, maybe other things. Boredom could be reactive in response to the classroom, what's happening in the classroom. And these are two different types of boredom. You cannot address this type of boredom using techniques suitable for this type of boredom, and vice versa. It's two different things. In the literature, there is also a distinction between task-focused boredom and self-focused boredom. Task-focused has to do with if they think that the task is meaningless, the task is problematic. Self-focused has to do in situations that frustrate students. They think that it's too difficult for them. The problem is in me, not in the task. I think I have problems. I don't have the prerequisite knowledge. I'm not a good learner. I think it's too difficult. I start to doubt myself. Then, so I get bored and frustrated. Again, these are two different things. To address this type of boredom, you need to address the task itself. Here, you think of the learner themselves. There is state boredom and trait boredom. Some researchers argue that some learners have kind of state boredom that is consistent, or this should be related to consistent tendency to disengage and be disinterested. State boredom is transient, context dependent, and short lived. Yeah, and trait boredom is consistent tendency to be disengaged. Again, these are just like anxiety, just like motivation, just like other things. There is transient part of it, and then there is more consistent parts of it. And it varies from learner to learner and even from classroom to classroom. There is external and internal boredom proneness, perception of the environment as uninteresting versus difficulty in getting involved in tasks. Some people might have more proneness to being bored compared to other learners. So, boredom, even though boredom is pervasive, there isn't much research on it. And if you ask teachers, boredom is one of the main topics they have on their minds. Research has found high rates of boredom, alienation, and disconnection with schooling. Studies have characterized high school students in particular as bored, staring out classroom windows, counting the seconds for the bell to ring. This is common. They are there simply because they have to be there. So if this is the case, you are teaching, but they are not learning. So by extension, you are not actually teaching. You're just talking to them, and then the outcome is not what we actually need. So what is engagement now? So motivation is the intention to learn, or the desire to learn, or to do any activity for that matter. So it is inward, it's inside you. Engagement is the actual learning act, and it is outward. So motivation is a prerequisite to engagement. So we have motivation, and this motivation leads to engagement, and engagement leads to learning. So motivation alone will not jump to learning if there is no engagement. So no matter how motivated a learner is, if they don't actually go and learn, whether formally or informally, there is no learning. It's just the intention to do something doesn't magically manifest into the outcome. There needs to be some intermediary steps. But of course, I have to emphasize that this doesn't have to be this linear. This leads to this, and this leads to this. There could be feedback loops. When learners learn something, they become motivated. And when they engage and find the task interesting, they might be motivated, even if they are not motivated at the start. So there is feedback loops. It's more complex than just this linear representation might imply. So, as I said, no engagement, no learning. And this is why engagement has been described as the holy grail of learning. In fact, whenever the phrase engaging students came up in discussions with teachers, they seemed to respond to the concept keenly, showing great interest in it, more even than in the popular term motivation. So actual classroom teachers are think that engagement is kind of more important than motivation because engagement is more directly related to the classroom. Yes, they agreed motivation is relevant and important, but their immediate classroom concern was more than merely motivating learners. They wanted to engage them in the various tasks and activities. If a student does not have the motivation to learn the language, but the teacher could somehow engage them in the task, make it interesting for them, they might learn despite their lack of motivation because they are engaged in the activity. And this engagement might actually lead to higher motivation. The reverse linear trend that we saw in the previous slide. So what matters to the teacher in actual classrooms is engagement more than motivation itself. So engagement, there are some definitions of engagement in the literature. According to some researchers, engagement is the effortful learning through interaction with the teacher and the classroom learning opportunities. Some researchers consider engagement as energized, directed, and sustained actions to learn or to do whatever. The extent of a student's active involvement in a learning activity. So it almost does not make sense to refer to student engagement because it cannot be separated or disentangled from the social context in which it occurs. I'm going to talk about social engagement. What is social engagement in a bit, and how it is that engagement is not a psychological variable per se, but connected more to learners' relationships and responses to the learning environment. So there is, when you say motivation, you can in some sense talk about people who are kind of overall motivated, tend to be highly motivated regardless of the context. They want to learn the subject. But when it comes to engagement, it kind of doesn't make much sense to say engagement in the abstract without connection to the activity that they are expected to do. And not doing it does not necessarily reflect lack of motivation, but maybe there's problems with the task or the environment that is preventing them from engaging properly and consequently learning from that activity. So what are the characteristics of engagement? Well, involves action, and this action can be physical, can be mental, as we saw, that cognitive and emotional, context dependent. It depends on cultures, communities, families, schools, peers, classrooms, and specific tasks and activities. So usually for the teacher, it starts from here. That's really in the realm of teachers. For the others, teachers can't really do much to change cultures and communities. But still, in many cases, these, broader scope influences can impair or improve engagement. It has an object. It's not like being motivated to learn something in general. It's engaged with a topic, a person, a situation, or an activity or task. So it has to be something tangible that they are expected to be involved in. Engagement is also dynamic, malleable. They could be engaged at the beginning of the task and not the end of the task. Engagement might fluctuate depending on who they are paired with, if it's pair work or group work, and other factors. So it's dynamic and malleable. So when we think of behavioral engagement, as I mentioned at the beginning, researchers, what they do when they measure behavioral engagement, they may look at the amount and quality of learners' active participation in class as an indicator of behavioral engagement. Some researchers rely on word counts and term counts as indicators of behavioral engagement. If students produce more output, more conversations, more turn taking, then this is an indication of behavioral engagement. Voluntary involvement in speaking, it's not just when they speak when they are asked to speak, but also when they do so voluntarily. Interactional initiation, and time they spend on the task. Persistent it includes persistence, an amount of semantic content produced, persistence on task. And so these are, we will come back to this aspect of measurement and see that there are a lot of problematic points here and when we try to measure engagement. Cognitive engagement. Cognitive engagement is the mental effort, deliberate, selective, sustained attention to achieve a given task or learning goals. Now, at first sight, when we go back to behavioral engagement, it's clearly different from cognitive engagement. Behavioral engagement means the behaviors that people engage in. Cognitive engagement relates to what happens in their minds. But in reality, they are so connected. So manifestations of cognitive engagement include peer interactions. Now, peer interactions was kind of interaction and involved with others, is kind of student questioning. It's kind of, how can you actually disconnect cognitive from behavior? Because you are using behavioral cues to infer cognitive processes. Hesitation and repetition, volunteering answers, kind of we are repeating ourselves. These are available in the literature. They have been used in the literature as so we start to ask questions. Is this cognitive or behavioral? Or is it that it doesn't make sense to state that there are dimensions? Well, it does make sense because conceptually these are different. And as we will see later, it becomes very useful when we think of fake engagement. So we will come back to that part later. Exchanging ideas, offering feedback, providing direction, informing, and explaining. These are found in the literature and as manifestations that researchers use as indicators of engagement. Emotional engagement. Effective reactions as they participate in target activities or tasks. So this could be positive indicators like engagement, enthusiasm, anticipation. It could be negative indicators like anxiety, boredom, frustration, anger. Again, how do we distinguish these different aspects? When you say enjoyment, you look at the student, you see external indicators and say you infer from behavioral indicators. So behavioral indicators are the primary point of departure. And then we start to infer inward and internal states of the learner. So as we will see later, we need a reform in how we measure engagement because it's very indirect. Once it moves away from behavioral engagement, it's no longer direct. And I will argue even behavioral engagement in many cases is actually indirect. So let's go. Social engagement. Now, social engagement. In the literature, sometimes social engagement is referred to as another dimension of engagement. So we have behavioral engagement, cognitive engagement, emotional engagement, and now social engagement. However, not all researchers at least, agree that the social dimension is actually a distinct dimension that can be contrasted with these other dimensions, because the social engagement is the context where learning takes place, and learning is always relational. There is something. It could be in a classroom with other human beings, but it could be, the learner is in their room doing something. There is high or low social availability in the environment. So each of these can have high or low social availability. So it doesn't really make much sense to think of social engagement as a distinct type of or dimension of motivation, but more like the context that learning takes place or engagement takes place in. So, but it's useful. I'm not saying it is not useful. And because having connections and affiliations with peers, with the teacher, with having reciprocality and mutuality, willingness to take part, and these are all studied in the literature as in research in engagement and how effective engagement is in relation to the social environment. So you could have emphatic discourse move. This is studied in the literature, which is learners' willingness to listen to others and to the teacher. And as you can see, without this willingness to listen and to take part in the social context, this can have ramifications for engagement and for eventual learning success. So, how is it? Let's see how engagement is measured more concretely. So, the most common is behavioral questionnaires. There are advantages and disadvantages in each method. This is life. So, for questionnaires, it's suitable for psychometric testing and validation. Simple, straightforward, measures can be standardized, but it is limited to self-report. And this is a problem. So if we use a questionnaires, even behavioral engagement becomes indirect. We are not observing behavioral engagement per se. We are relying on students' reports of their own behavioral engagement. So it lacks real-time data collection. And this includes, biases and other things, that social desirability and all sorts of things can creep in. So despite the ease that surveys afford researchers and the convenience and the ability to collect large samples, there are a lot of drawbacks to using or exclusively relying on self-report measures. Then you can have observations and expert ratings. And this can be quantitative or qualitative. It doesn't have to be either or. And the results can be more detailed. You can observe at least the behavioral aspect more directly and capture it in real time. And you can study contextual factors. And it can be standardized. So it's not like observing generally. It can be standardized just like questionnaires. But it also has drawbacks. It's hard to get larger samples. And if you don't have larger samples, we have questions about generalizability. It can be time consuming to assess. It lacks the ability to clearly measure affective and cognitive engagement. Again, especially the behavioral aspect, we can observe it. But when it comes to cognitive and emotional engagement, observers, even expert observers, just like teachers, you can only infer what's happening inside the students' minds in terms of their cognitive and emotional involvement in the lesson. You can have interviews, and interviews are useful for collecting cognitive processing data. If you want to understand what's happening inside the student's mind, you can have a conversation with them and ask them. And interviews will also reveal things that affect learning that are not observable within the four walls of the classroom. You can ask the student and say, so why did you do this? They will say, oh, last night, this, and that. In the class before or last month, this, and that. So you can learn things that you can't simply by observing how learning takes place. So it can give in-depth information, but it has some disadvantages. Usually you can do one interview at a time, time consuming. Still, there are social desirability problems and biases, just like questionnaires that we saw in the previous slide. It requires interviewer training. It might look easy, just chat with the student, but it's not, it's tricky. It's a skill that you develop, how to become a good interviewer in the academic sense. And again, it may be difficult to generalize combined with its, small sample size that you can collect. Then we have experience sampling. We are now getting to more interesting methods. This is relatively recent, not very recent, like 3 decades ago or something, but definitely more recent compared with like interviews and questionnaires. Questionnaires has been around like for a century or something since Galton. So real-time engagement ratings. So before we get to this, what is experience sampling? Usually experience sampling is students either are given a diary that they handwrite in, or it's a smartphone app that gives them a notification at different times of the day or within one classroom and asks them specific questions to answer at that particular moment. How do you feel now? And then after 5 minutes or 5 hours, depending on your research question, it also gives them a notification and say, how do you feel now? Whatever questions depends on your research question, of course. You ask them. So it's this. That's where the name comes from, experience sampling. It gets notifications to the students. In the past, they used to use diaries and things, but now more and more researchers are using, technology like smartphones. So you get real-time engagement ratings, even outside the classroom, even when students are at home, even when students are on holiday, even students are on the weekend, you can still do this, and researchers and teachers do not have to be present to collect this data. So it can have some insights that the other methods don't afford. So it tracks the length and intensity of engagement, observation recorded without interference from an observer, multiple students' data collected simultaneously, many data points over time, able to trace changes in development. So technically or potentially, you can do it over a longer period of time, affordably, and collect longitudinal data to track development and change over time. Still, it's not easy. You will need specialized software. and it can be resource intensive. And at the end of the day, the quality depends on responses from the participants. The participants are not obligated to reply to your notifications. And if they do, they are not obliged to give you accurate answers. They may have more fun activities to do when they are outside the classroom. And how many items are you going to include per notification? People are, you give me 100 questions to answer, every 5 minutes or every 5 hours, depending on, your design. You can have only a limited set of questions when you sample experience. And again, it's not suitable for younger children, some student populations. They need to have the technology, they need to have this, they need to have the commitment, they need to, there are a lot of prerequisites for a study using this design to be successful. Okay, so let's look at questionnaires. So this is an example of a questionnaire measuring engagement in my language class today or this week. It depends on your research question. I stayed focused even when it was difficult to understand. This is supposed to be behavioral, right? So staying focused, is it really behavioral or cognitive? It's kind of, the lines are blurred somehow. Staying focused doesn't mean you don't engage in anything that distracts you from the activity. So that's behavioral, you're refraining, or is it thinking and being focused on the lesson? It's kind of, the lines are blurred. I participated in all activities. Okay, that's engagement, behavioral engagement. I kept trying my best even when it was hard. I continued working until I completed my work. I just pretended like I was working. This R means reversed, which means that researchers will then, because this is negative, even though it's not literally negative, having not, but the meaning is negative because I pretended. So they will recode it so that a higher mark on this means less engagement. Unlike, so these are positive, but this is negative. I didn't participate in class, much in class. I did other things when I was supposed to be paying attention. I paid attention and listened carefully. Again, the same issue. Is this behavioral or cognitive? Let's see the scale for cognitive engagement. I went through my work carefully to make sure it was done right. It's okay. Going through your work is not just cognitive, it involves behavioral aspect also. I thought about different ways to solve problems in my work. Okay, so that's kind of cognitive. I tried to connect new learning to the things I already learned before. I tried to understand my mistakes. When I got something wrong, I preferred to be told the answer than to do the work. This is reversed. I didn't think too hard while I was doing the work. I only studied the easy parts because the task was hard. I did just enough to get by. Again, this is kind of behavioral. Somehow it involves some behavioral parts. If you just do just enough to get by. And by the way, this is in one of our papers, so I'm not criticizing other researchers. This is in our own work that we have this kind of interconnections between the different dimensions of engagement. Emotional engagement. I look forward to the next class. I enjoyed learning new things. This is kind of intrinsic motivation. It's just so similar to intrinsic and having fun, which is by definition emotional engagement, but there isn't much research linking emotional engagement with intrinsic motivation explicitly. but the items used are almost copy-paste, almost copy-paste. I wanted to understand what I was learning. Why wanting something is emotional? I think this is cognitive, right? I felt good while I was in the class. Yeah, feeling good is emotional. I felt frustrated when I was in class. I found it boring to be in the class. I didn't want to be in the class. I felt that I didn't care about learning. Okay, so there are so many issues with self-reports because it is indirect. And when we divide it into the different parts, then the problem is compounded because sometimes the same indicator can reflect behavioral engagement and can reflect cognitive engagement and can reflect emotional engagement. But this is not necessarily a bad thing per se, because in order to be engaged, the learner needs all parts of engagement for genuine engagement. We will see later fake engagement is when how things go wrong from this perspective. And psychometric research shows that there are no three distinct dimensions of motivation, but they are all one latent variable, one factor. Maybe because of this overlap in items, maybe for other reasons. Maybe its engagement itself is a one-dimensional construct. So this is open for research. So this is the problem here is not only is it self-report, so it is indirect, we don't directly observe the behavior, but it's kind of, if I go back, in my language class today or this week, it's kind of abstract. It's not related to a specific task that we are trying to understand, but we need to also complement this method with approaches that measure engagement in one task and unobtrusively. So we are coming to this expression now, this word unobtrusively, which means you do not interrupt learning to ask. You let learning happen, and after learning engagement in a task, and then you start asking students about or participants about, because the participants could be teachers, of course, about their engagement. So one method is the idiodynamic method introduced by McIntyre and colleagues. So what is the idiodynamic method? The idiodynamic method requires specialized software like this one. And this is available for free. Any researcher interested in using it, they can go and download it and use it. It's available. So what's happening here is that first you need a video, you need to video record an activity first. So here, these students, this is the focal student, and they were engaged in some activity. They could be reading aloud, they could be whatever activity you are doing. You videotape the activity. After you finish this videotaping, you take the student to the lab, have them sit at a computer, and ask them to watch the recording of themselves. And this is the important part, increase FLCA for language classroom anxiety or decrease. And per second or per 2 seconds or per 5 seconds, you control it. They click on it to increase their anxiety, to say, at this moment, I was very anxious. Or if it is enjoyment, at this point, I was, highly enjoying the task. But at this moment, you click on decrease, the more you click on it, the lower it goes. So it could be per second or more. And it could be combined with think aloud protocols. You can explain. So why at this particular moment, your anxiety or your engagement or your enthusiasm or your attention was low or high. So can you explain it to us? And this can be combined with physiological markers like heart rate. Again, now we are getting into more techie stuff. We will get into a bit more techie stuff also in a bit. And I will argue that we need to move to that direction. We can't just rely on questionnaires, forever. We have to start thinking outside the box. So, in a study by Gregerson and colleagues, the learners were videotaped. I'm not sure why they here, wearing wristband heart monitors with a chest strap. Yeah, smartwatch, just think of it as smartwatch, to collect physiological, why is there a hyphen here? Heart rate data. So in this study, they videotaped the participants for idiodynamic rating later on, and they collected heart rate data. The students were giving presentations. And so they were videotaped giving the presentation. While they were giving the presentation, they also wearing smartwatches to monitor their heart rate. They provided idiodynamic ratings, moment by moment, to study anxiety. And then they had interviews. Have you just watched your video? What is your overall impression? How did you feel hearing, seeing yourself? How did you prepare, etc., etc.? Just interview questions to better understand the student's experience. Let's look at the results. There are some interesting patterns here. So each of these graphs or flowcharts or line bars, these are 6 participants. And if you look here, HAP means high anxiety participant, LAP, low anxiety participant. So they were classified into those who have high anxiety and those who have low anxiety so that we can compare them. And the lighter colors is the physiological data, and the darker color is the idiodynamic rating. So if we look at the first one here, the dark one is the idiodynamic. They reported high anxiety, even though their heart rate did not suggest high anxiety. Their heart rate wasn't beating that fast, suggesting that they are kind of comfortable. They were not, but psychologically, they were thinking, no, I'm anxious. And then their heart rate started to increase. A kind of self-fulfilling prophecy, apparently. Their heart rate did not show any anxiety. It was normal. Then they started to reveal faster heart rates. Let's look at the other learner. The other learner was kind of panicking, fluctuating hard. No, oh my God, I'm going to top anxiety. Then, it's okay. No, it's high anxiety. No, it's okay. So even though their heart rate was there wasn't that much fluctuation. It's kind of panicking. This learner panicking a lot. Sometimes learners can, reasonably reflect their physiological markers. It's kind of very close. And you have, again, this, wide fluctuations. So it varies from learners to learners. But overall, when they investigated the correlations between physiological markers and idiodynamic ratings, it was largely high in the 0.7. In one case, it was 0.59, almost 0.6. But generally, it was 0.7, which suggests that some people might consider it validity because it gives you high correlations between the things, so it's not way off. So, problems. Even in the idiodynamic method, there are some problems. The research is descriptive. So the student does the work, and after they finish, we try to understand what was happening when they were engaged. we try to uncover existing patterns. If we learn something, the task is over. Good luck, or hard luck. Next time we hope that we will do better. So it's not an intervention. You are not intervening. It's still, despite the technology involved, heart rate and idiodynamic ratings in specialized software, it's still observational and descriptive. And what we learn happens after the fact. It is not an intervention. What we need is that we need an intervention that uses physiological markers, for example, heart rate. We want to make it still unobtrusively. We don't want to interrupt learning. And we want to have real-time application. We don't want to wait until the task is over and then we learn something, and then we hope when students, in the next class or in the next task, we will implement what we learn. Teachers don't have time for this. No, researchers may have time for this, and they will spend a year or a year and a half trying to publish their papers, even though the task was like 5 minutes. We need real-time applications of interventions to improve engagement. So I'm going to give an example. This is a patent that a colleague of mine and myself obtained recently. If you see here, method and apparatus to lower foreign language learning, foreign language anxiety during listening. The font is a bit small here, but this paper explains this. So I'm going to briefly explain our idea. So we thought heart rate, when it is fast, it indicates anxiety. Okay, and you can measure this anxiety through a smartwatch, for example, in real time, but there is still no application. Another problem is that in listening in particular, when the listening, the language, the second language that the students are listening to, when it is fast, students become anxious. And research shows that when the students become anxious, their comprehension drops, and they lose track, and their comprehension deteriorates, and all sorts of problems because of anxiety. So we thought, why don't we use this technology in order to adjust listening speed in real time, unobtrusively, in their smartphones? And this is what we did. So anxiety, again, leads to high rate and low performance and possibly disengagement. And when the language they are listening to is fast, they become anxious. So we developed this tool to use physiological data, heart rate, to auto-adjust the listening speed. And the research shows that if you give students the option, how fast they want to have the listening speed, they prefer slower ones, because slower speeds, because it's easier for them to understand. And language learners appreciate this. Listening is not easy. So it's kind of like playback speed on YouTube and other channels. You can control the speed, you can make it faster or lower. So it auto adjusts the speed based on their anxiety measured through heart rate automatically. So the learner can just pay attention to the listening material without worrying about rewinding or making it slower. It will automatically adjust speed based on their anxiety level. Here we have this, because it's required when you get a patent, you have this design, but it can be implemented in a smartphone app connected to a smartwatch. It doesn't have to be that fancy, but still it requires inter or transdisciplinary collaboration. the idea is simple, but the implementation is hard. And in this paper, we review some literature, and we, for example, review the two cultures, which has been argued like for 70 or 80 years, I think, uh, between the sciences and the social sciences. They are two different disciplines with very little overlap, but they can learn a lot from each other. So we need to move beyond traditional research designs into more advanced ones, but this requires collaborating with people that we don't usually collaborate with: computer scientists, biologists, neuroscientists, other things, which is kind of uh, electrophysiology, another big word here, which requires moving away from our comfort zones. Okay, finally, now we reach fake engagement. Oh, what does all this mean for fake engagement? What is even fake engagement? Fake engagement happens when there is a disconnect between behavioral engagement and cognitive and emotional engagement. So now we see the fruits of distinguishing different dimensions of engagement, despite some blurry lines between them. One of the benefits of it is understanding fake engagement. So again, behavioral engagement is fake engagement is behavioral engagement without the cognitive and emotional aspects. So there are some terms related to it. Strategic compliance. These words are available in the literature if you look for them. Doing what is expected or required. Ritual compliance, doing the minimum required to avoid negative consequences. Retreatism, causing no problems as long as not forced to comply. Just okay, just let just keep an eye on the clock until the class is over. Or even rebellion, refusing to comply and actively diverting attention elsewhere. Maladaptive engagement, partying or staying up late before the exam, which is related to self-handicapping, where students, in order to comfort themselves when they fail, they say, oh, I failed not because I don't know, or I'm not smart, or I'm not intelligent, or I'm not a good learner, just because it's a party last night. So this is my excuse. Studenting, all of these fall under the term studenting, behaving in a way that does not lead to real learning. Like just, figuring out shortcuts to get high grades, or, the point that will be in the exam, or, any way that allows the student to beat the system. So it's not actual learning. It's just the exam is just the goal in itself. Grades become the goal in itself, not the learning. So despite being this is a very pervasive issue, surprisingly there isn't much research on it. All teachers complain about this. Researchers are studying different things and having fun. So students appear to be engaged, but they are intentionally, this is also a key word here, they are intentionally manipulating their behaviors to deceive the teacher. It's not just happens, it's intentionally pretending to be listening, faking it to appease the teacher maybe, or for social norms. And this is counterproductive for them. At the end of the day, they are not going to learn. So fake engagement is behaviors that are made consciously, or it could be unconsciously, because part of social norms and other things, by learners to achieve an outside appearance of being attentive and on task. However, in reality, their internal states are not congruent, and for diverse motives may be complying or just merely pretending compliance. Compare this to authentic engagement, where there is congruence between the internal and external states, of engagement. This leads to genuine, deep, and meaningful learning. And this involves all types of all dimensions of engagement, not just the behavioral aspect, but also cognitive and emotional. So because this is important, I'm going to overview a study on fake engagement by Mercer and colleagues. So in that study, the researchers wanted to understand fake engagement. So again, despite being a pervasive problem, you can find it pretty much in any classroom. We don't understand it much. Why? Basically, what, when, and why. These are the questions that these researchers asked. So they did focus interviews and individual interviews to understand from the learner's perspective, why do you fake it in the classroom? Let's see what they found. So what does fake engagement look like? So they asked their students, and the students complied and gave them answers. So first, bodily display behavior, eye movement, gestures, and posture. They just nod and have eye contact with the teacher so that the teacher feels that the students are listening. Or they even a very concentrated thinking and writing pose. I'm thinking with you, but actually I have no idea what you are saying. So this bodily display of fake engagement, it's very hard for the teacher to figure it out if there is no cooperation from learners. Again, teaching with no learning, which doesn't make sense. Task-related actions. They may be taking notes or reading, but actually they have no idea what the teacher is saying. They may be studying for another exam that we'll have later on that day, for example, or even taking fake notes. They may be doodling or writing, I don't know what, or even using their laptops during the class. Teacher may think that they are genuinely engaged with them, but in reality, not so much. So the teacher can't really tell what I am doing. This is one of the students, a quotation from one of the participants. When you open your laptop, it's like a wall between you and the teacher. Most of the time, they stand in front. They don't really know what you are doing. If you don't type anything, I think they might know that you are not doing anything. So in order to make it go full circle, you start typing something on your keyboard so that it looks like you are engaged in the class. Second research question, when do students fake engagement? Physical conditions. Those times where you are kind of tired, you almost fall asleep, but it also has a lot to do I think there's something missing, with having lunch before something, or just really, really sleepy. So you can see the language it's transcribed from an oral interview, so it's kind of I think the room is very important, the environment. Some classes are in the basement, it's not good, the lighting, the air. So sometimes even the temperature in the room can have a negative effect on learning. Teaching style, lecturing, seating arrangement can also lead to fake engagement. The organization of the class just in rows, sit like in school, at university hall, where teachers just stand in front, tells you 1.5 hours about certain topics. This is very hard to concentrate. So because it's very hard, they want to pretend that they are listening, just waiting for the class to finish. I think at the university, how the tables form definitely makes a huge difference, because in some rooms there is a U. You can sometimes have positive sides and negative sides. If you are sitting on this side facing other students, it happens easily that you look at them doing. Something's missing here. It's really hard. The rows often schools use is calming, but not engaging. But again, everybody facing the front, something like lectures, it's easy to focus. It depends on the setting. And of course, you have all these excuses and sometimes contradictory preferences that students have. If you have to be there just because it's mandatory, but you know there is nothing you can get out, just I have to be here, has no consequences for my future career. I just want to get, a passing grade and that's it. Just, I don't want to make any trouble. Other attentional priorities. I had a very important exam the next day, but when we were sitting in the seminar, in my head, I was revising everything. I was thinking of something completely else. But I was still in the class. So definitely, because I got very nervous about the exam, it's a really important exam. When you have classes in the basement, you can see all the people walking by. That can be distracting, and laptops can be distracting too, because you can always see what other students are doing on their laptops that not always course related. When you sit next to them, you can see everything. So again, distraction from students. So students fake their engagement with the teacher. So why bother? Why not just show that you are not engaged? Social norms. I think it's polite, kind of polite to be show respect to the teacher. Although I don't care, you can't just disturb others. Because if you engage in disruptive behaviors, that's not, socially acceptable. Or to please the teacher. We are participating in the activity, although we are not interested and we don't enjoy, because the teacher gives us a lot of pressure and we have to participate, especially in the class. We really have to participate because we are quite small groups. She knows everyone. She always tells us what she knows exactly. When we are not participating, it will influence our grade in bad ways. So again, to please the teacher, either because they respect the teacher or because they are afraid of the teacher. So they give you this facade of being engaged and focused, and they are taking notes and thinking hard, behavioral. But cognitively, they are thinking elsewhere. Emotionally, they are bored, they are frustrated, they are not interested, they are thinking of another exam that they are worried about, or thinking of, they want to have fun after the class, they have something else more interesting. Now, putting this in mind, keeping this in mind, what is the validity of classroom observation? As I mentioned at the beginning, one of the methods used to research engagement is classroom observation. It can be expert ratings, it can be standardized, it can be etc., etc. But if you observe active engagement of the sorts that we saw in the previous slides, paying attention and taking notes, how can you, as a researcher, know that this is genuine and not fake engagement? It's very challenging. And so, what is the validity of classroom observation? When you quantify students' behaviors, like, raising hands, participating, and we saw at the beginning of the slide, taking initiative, questioning, thinking, and paying attention, and you have charts and rating scales and checklists, and you standardize these and train people to do it, and you give detailed and precise descriptions in naturalistic settings. It's not even in lab settings, but that's, at the end of the day, it's the observable behavior. We make cues about cognitive and emotional, but sometimes students can fake it. And that's why, as I mentioned previously, we need this integration with the sciences to have more advanced kind of, including physiological markers, and in order that are unobtrusive and that do not rely on direct self-report or even a direct observation, external observation. So, as a caveat, I have to emphasize that this doesn't mean that observation is completely useless. It's just that we need to keep these limitations in mind And we need to figure out ways to kind of observe cognitive and emotional engagement using more direct and unobtrusive measures. Okay, after all this, now we reach meta-motivation. What is meta-motivation? Now we have an overview. We had an overview of engagement. Now meta-motivation, the new kid in the street or whatever. What is meta-motivation? The processes by which individuals monitor and control their motivational states in order to achieve their goals. Kind of fancy definition, academic definition, but what meta-motivation means is how people understand their motivation and how they think, they believe, they perceive the best way to go about engaging in tasks. So it's kind of like metacognition. Metacognition is thinking how you understand your cognitive processes. So, but metamotivation is specifically about motivation, obviously. It's like self-regulation. Self-regulation means engaging in behaviors that to regulate your own motivation. Metamotivation is about what you believe and how you believe you should go about doing this, whether it is self-regulation alone or with a group or with the teacher. So, research into metamotivation is not directly concerned with the optimal form of motivation per se. That's a different topic alone, that comes later on. But with how individuals actually manage and regulate their motivation, their knowledge of the most effective ways to do so, the extent to which this knowledge aligns with evidence-based findings on the optimal forms of motivation in various contexts, and the effect of this knowledge on selection of regulatory strategies, flexibility and adapting to changing task demands, and on goal pursuits, and on the quality of life. And it's a long definition, so let's break it down. So meta-motivation is not about the optimal form of motivation per se. That's a separate area. It's about how individuals manage and regulate their motivation and their knowledge about how hard they should study, how they should self-regulate, how their beliefs and perception, and whether this belief and knowledge aligns with empirical evidence from research. It may or it may not. And the effect on their behavior, their flexibility, and on overall success and quality of life and well-being. So, this regulation of motivation could be directed toward quantity or intensity, could be directed toward the quality or type of motivation. And this is a very important point that I want to spend a few slides focusing on. Quantity or intensity is kind of straightforward. Are you studying hard enough, or should you focus more and study for a longer period? That's it. You're studying hard enough. You are not studying hard enough. Study hard enough. Study harder. It's kind of intensity and quantity is more or less straightforward. But what is quality of motivation? There are different types of motivation. Yes, there are different types of motivation, and all of this will help us understand who needs motivation the most. So in the next few slides, I'm going to focus on quality of motivation, and I will show that there are actually different types of motivation that students can have, different mindsets, let's say, and the effect of these different types. So the idea comes from task, motivation, fit. And sometimes it is called context-specific trade-off. I'm going to explain this idea. So from the name, task, motivation, fit, it suggests, intuitively, that there are different types of motivation, and these different types fit different tasks. which is exactly what this means, so as I will explain now. So there are different types of main types of motivation. There is a promotion orientation, which leads to divergent thinking. Divergent thinking just means creative thinking and thinking outside the box and like this. And then there is prevention orientation, which leads to convergent thinking, which means being careful. These are two different types of motivational mindsets or orientations that people have. And again, it's not that one is good and one is bad. It's the fit between motivation and task. Promotion orientation is suitable for brainstorming and persuasive activities because it stimulates an eager motivational state seeking opportunities for gains. You are creative, so you have to come up with interesting ideas and think outside the box. But a prevention orientation is more suitable when your task is to proofread or critique or detect logical problems because it has a vigilant motivational state that stimulates guarding against potential losses. So what does this mean in practice? So let's imagine that you are asked to go in a room and brainstorm some activity as part of a group. They say, we want to do some event and we want you to brainstorm some activity. So this is brainstorming that falls under promotion orientation. You want to be creative and think of interesting ideas outside the box. Now, imagine that the team leader says, if you give an idea that is not interesting, you are going to be penalized one way or another. It doesn't work like this. You can't ask me to brainstorm an activity that's inherently promotional and then say, you need to be careful because if we don't like your ideas, we're going to penalize you. It doesn't work like this. This brainstorming session is not going to be effective. On the other hand, if your task is to proofread, we want a prevention orientation. We want people to be careful. We want people to feel that if they miss a mistake, they will be penalized so that they go slowly. They don't want to miss something. So for this, research shows that for this type of activity, a prevention orientation is more suitable, and students people, not just students, perform better. While, as you can imagine, for promotion activities, a divergent thinking is more suitable. So these are two different types of motivation. And again, it's not that one type is bad, it's that the fit. What do you want your students to do? Do you want them to be careful? Then you promote a prevention orientation. You stimulate a prevention orientation so that they are vigilant. And this is useful in many language learning contexts. Or is your task, does it require promotion, creativity? In this case, you want to stimulate an eager motivational state. So we need to have a fit between the task and the motivation you as a teacher stimulate. So let's have another theory. In self-determination theory, also, we have the same idea. We have autonomous regulation, which is basically intrinsic motivation, and we have extrinsic motivation or controlled regulation. Many people believe that intrinsic motivation is always good. Well, there are cases, yeah, intrinsic motivation is very useful, but there are cases where extrinsic motivation and having rewards is also useful. So it's suitable for tasks that are straightforward and close-ended, that do not demand high absorption or intricacy, that have clearly defined performance criteria, that are evaluated based on quality, not quantity. Just want to people to produce and produce and produce and produce. There are tasks, there are careers based on this, that they need to produce and produce and produce things. And here, extrinsic motivation does help. If you are intrinsically motivated to do this, you will get bored because it's not really fun to do. And this includes copying numbers and proofreading also. And again, you can see overlaps between the theory on this slide and the theory in the previous slide. There is a lot of overlap, and in both cases, there is a fit between task and motivation. Let's have a third theory, control level theory. According to this theory, there are two levels of control, high level and low level. The high level is abstract, the low level is concrete. Let's have an example. In high level control, it's about the desirability of the task. For example, why should I improve my language proficiency? This question is suitable for somebody contemplating whether to take a course or not, whether they should learn a second language or not. This is suitable. A low-level control is suitable for more concrete activities, like, how easy is it to practice, Unit 5, for example. A low-level control is related to the feasibility of the task, not the desirability. Okay, we are finished. We are done with desirability. Now we have a task, and I need to do it, and thinking in terms of feasibility. So a low-level construct, research shows, when you think about how easy it is, it's more suitable than thinking long-term motivation. It's not relevant anymore. Yeah, we need that, but in a different context. We need something that is sensitive to the immediate environment. So metamotivation studies people's understanding of these different types of motivation, their beliefs about the type of motivation that is suitable, and whether these beliefs align with research evidence or not. Let's have another example in another area where metamotivation research exists. It's about task rewards. Humans have an inherent need for autonomy. This comes from self-determination theory. And external rewards can interfere with intrinsic motivation. This is very counterintuitive. The idea that if you give people rewards for something, this can have a damaging effect on their motivation. This is very counterintuitive, and people have a hard time getting their heads around it. How? Grades are kind of rewards. Money, financial incentives are rewards. How can you say that? So let's have an example. So if a parent tells their child, you have to study, and if you do study, I will reward you with this and that. This will and does motivate the child to engage in that activity because they want that reward. There's no problem in that. But the question is, why does the parent resort to giving rewards in the first place? What is their philosophy? Their philosophy is that if without a reward, they will not engage in that task. So I give them the reward so that they engage in that task. If the task is already interesting, there is a logical fallacy in this philosophy because it assumes that humans are kind of tabula rasa and they do not have an inherent need to engage in interesting tasks. You have to push them to be involved in interesting tasks. While in reality, people have a need for autonomy. They don't want to be pushed. And if you do push them, you will see a boost in engagement, but it is temporary. Once the reward is no longer there, once the parent or the teacher is no longer there, they will stop engaging in that activity. The problem is this does not promote lifelong learning. It's only, in fact, it will damage. Research shows that it will, if they come to the task with intrinsic motivation, and then you give them reward to be engaged in that activity, this will have a damaging effect on the existing motivation. They will stop doing the task when there is no longer reward. They would say, what's the point? There's no more reward, or the teacher is no longer here, or the parent is no longer here. Again, this is not intuitive, and many people have a hard time understanding. So let's look at it differently. Different types of rewards that are classified in the literature. There is from task non-contingent all the way to competitively contingent. So task non-contingent is reward is given simply for being present and does not specifically require actually being engaged with the target activity. Believe it or not, this actually very motivating because you basically tell the student or the child, don't worry about the reward, you will get the reward, just engage in this activity because it is fun. If it is not fun, then that's a problem, of course. Then we need extrinsic motivation. But the question is, why do you want them to do this, non-fun? Why don't you make it fun so that students learn? That's a different story. But as I said, if it is not fun, if it is mundane and you are interested only in the quantity and not the quality, then that's a different story, and intrinsic rewards can be useful. But if you take away this reward so that they are not concerned they will get the reward, then they do have an inherent drive to engage in interesting activities. You don't need to push them. Then there is engagement contingent reward. Rewards are given for spending time, for being engaged with the target activity. Completion contingent rewards. You give them the reward when they complete the activity. Task contingent reward, larger category, explain both engagement contingent and completion contingent. So this task engagement basically means these two. These two, it depends on how they construe whether they have a negative impact on the student motivation or not, depends on how the individual construes the subjective significance of the reward. Is it controlling? They have to do it, or is it just something extra? So it depends. When we come here, we start to get into more problematic areas. Performance contingent. Reward is given for reaching a specific performance standard. So if you get, for example, 80%, you will get the reward. Now, we have problematic areas. You are basically telling your child that I will not like you and I will not love you unless you do this, and I will not reward you unless you do that. Assuming that this is the only way, that they don't have an inherent drive to do the activity. But they do actually have this inherent drive. You don't need this. You need to question the task and why it is not interesting for them. And the worst type is competitively contingent. The reward is given to the winner of the competition, and the loser gets lesser or no rewards. Even though this is practiced a lot in educational contexts, actually this practice is very damaging to students or to people in general when they get this. Okay, if you are in a sport, in playing a sport, that's different. If you are selecting talents, okay, that's different. But if you are providing education to the whole society, it doesn't make sense to use this approach anymore. And in fact, it's damaging to people, both winners and losers, as research suggests. So how is this research conducted? How do researchers figure out that when you give people a reward, it can have a damaging effect counterintuitively again? So this is a prototypical design. So the control group is invited to do a task. The task has to be interesting, again, because if it is boring, nobody wants to do it. You need incentives to do it, a boring task. So the control group is not told anything about reward. It's just, here is a task, please engage in this task, and that's it. The experimental group, on the other hand, is invited to do the same interesting task, but now they are also informed that they will receive contingent rewards. If you perform well, you will get, for example, a financial reward. This is the only difference between these two groups. So now here is the trick part. After some time, the experimental announces that the study is over, and the experimental ostensibly has to get some papers or some form or something and leaves the room. This is called the free choice period. Now, usually the lab is recorded with cameras, and the computers are equipped with tracking behavior when they click continue if the task is on a computer. But the learners the participants believe that the study is over. Now it's a free choice period. The participants have the chance to continue engaging in this interesting activity if they wish, or just, there are other distractors in the room, like magazines and other things that they can, distract themselves with while they are waiting for the experimenter to come back with the forms that they said they were going to bring. And the results show that the control group with the reward engage significantly less with the interesting activity, while the control group, where no reward was mentioned, they continue engaging with it more, even though they are not required anymore, because nothing really changed. So the main idea here is that if you introduce contingent rewards, it will have a temporary boost in engagement. But once this reward is no longer there, this boost will disappear, and it will even interfere with existing intrinsic motivation. This is the damaging, which is called the undermining effect in the literature. And this is not only, observed, in behavioral experiments, but also even at the neurological level. So in this study, the participants had their brain scans while engaging in this. So the reward group, there was a huge boost during session 1 when there was a reward. When the reward was gone, even in their neural activity, it was way below, no longer interested. But the no reward, this is not a significant drop. It's kind of still consistent. Also here, and in another task, you can see the control group where there is no reward is consistent because nothing really changed. Even when the experimenter is not here, they still engaged in the task. They were still interested. There's nothing changed. But look at the control group. There was a short-term boost, but in the long term, they are no longer interested. But they are doing the same task as the control group. It's exactly the same task. And the only thing that is different between the two groups is that the reward group were told that you will get a reward that is contingent on your performance. You see how damaging just this little piece of information is to motivation. So, and this, I did a study recently on this to see the metamotivational beliefs and metamotivational awareness of students and teachers about this the things that I just explained in the previous slide. So there were 130 teachers and over 250 students. They were provided with a prototypical research design showing that should be shown to result in the undermining effect. And the students were asked to predict the outcome of that experiment. So they were given the design of a study like this, and I would like this. So the researchers did this, and that. And at the end, the experimenter left the room, and the students were, or the research participants were in the room alone. What do you think is going to happen? Now, this tests their metamotivational beliefs and awareness of this kind of counterintuitive finding. Do teachers and students believe the same thing? Do their beliefs align with empirical evidence or not? And here are the results. So the predicted outcome, this is for teachers, the reward increases intrinsic motivation. There's almost 70% of teachers believed that rewards will increase motivation, which in reality it will decrease motivation, as we saw. So they had this mistaken belief, let's say, or sometimes it's called misbelief, or at least there is no alignment, at least at the bare minimum, there is no alignment between teachers' belief and empirical evidence. Students, it was 70% also had this belief that rewards will improve motivation. Again, it will improve motivation in the short term, but after the experiment, motivation there will be interference. The people who correctly predicted the outcome, only around 18, less than 20% of teachers and less than 15% of students. There is no difference based on gender, either in students or teachers. No significant difference based on teacher qualifications. And mostly there was no significance in terms of confidence. They, after they gave their predictions, they were told, how confident are you? Mostly, their confidence was pretty much, similar. Here is slightly a bit more confidence, but more or less it's similar. So this is an area of clear misalignment between empirical evidence and perceptions and the metamotivational awareness of teachers and students, where further research is required to understand the malleability of these beliefs. So, how to utilize metamotivation in a metamotivational framework? This is very difficult to read here because I couldn't, fit it. It has to be small. So I'm going to open it. I'm going to bring it. No, this one. I'm going to bring it here. And then we'll look at it. So metamotivation. This is a work in progress that I've been thinking about. How do you integrate metamotivation in research into mainstream research? What are the steps in order to do that? So first, you do substantive research, obviously. And the first question that you ask yourself is, are the results established? And then you have to say yes or no. If no, then you go back and do research. It doesn't make sense to go and check people's metamotivational awareness of something that is not already established. So it's something completely different. So it doesn't make much sense. You are asking different questions if you do this. You are not testing the alignment between people's beliefs and empirical evidence because your empirical evidence is still not established. So if you say yes, that the research is established or the results are established, then the next question to ask is, do participants agree? Now we can do metamotivational research. We have established results. in the literature. We have empirical evidence backing them. Now we ask participants, do you agree with these results or not? Again, they may say yes or no. If they say yes, it's too intuitive. You are not really informing practice. Teachers already know this. Students already know this. So they will ask, yeah, we know this. Why did you go spend 4 years getting a PhD on the effect of this on that? If you came and asked me, I would explain it to you in 5 minutes. So why do you spend all these years studying it? It's just too intuitive. Go back to step one and do more research. If you say no, if these people don't agree, if participants don't agree, they have a different idea, then there is no alignment between their beliefs and empirical evidence that is already established. Is it because they have a different context? Is it because other factors? Because participants might have a more fine-tuned understanding of their own local contexts that that researchers may not have, because researchers are more interested in generalizing, etc., etc. So maybe this misalignment is because of context or other factors. Is it the case? If yes, then you need to revise your theory, actually. Now we are learning from our participants, and we should revise this theory. If no, they still insist, even if these ideal contexts, they still don't agree with the empirical evidence, then we ask the next question, does it negatively affect the learning process? Yeah, there is misalignment. But so what? Does it really harm the learning process? Again, if no, then so what? What's the problem? Yeah, they don't agree with this, but it hardly makes any difference. So it's inconsequential. So you should go back to step one and look for something that might be consequential. If yes, it does affect them negatively, now it's time to do an intervention. So we should think of this clearly. When do you actually do an intervention? Ideally, you should follow these steps and justify your intervention. Because in many cases, you just tell people about it and they agree and that's it. They won't insist. You don't need an intervention in the first place. So you conduct an intervention and ask yourself, is it effective? If yes, yeah, congratulations, go and find another topic. Good job. If not, find another intervention and repeat. So this is how I think about the integration of metamotivation, and it's a really huge chart. So I had to fit it here, but I have to enlarge it. So finally, to conclude this long talk, how to promote authentic engagement, I'm going to draw from self-determination theory. People have at least 3 inherent needs: the need for competence, the need for autonomy, and the need for relatedness. They need to believe that they can do something. They need to believe that they have control over their learning. They are not doing the activity because the teacher is saying so, because they want to do it. And they have a need for interrelatedness. So if the atmosphere is conducive to creating positive relationships, whether with the teacher or with peers, to form a sense of security and connection, this will help promote learning. And classrooms need to be designed to satisfy these needs. So finally, to conclude, FAM 2019 used the wonderful metaphor that will be familiar to many, but with a twist. She explained that indeed teachers can take a horse to water, but they can't make it drink. However, they can make it thirsty. Focusing on engagement thus underlines the fact that who teachers are and what they do matter. So Our job is to make students thirsty, not to force them to drink the water. We need to make the task interesting so that they choose, again, autonomy, to engage willingly in this task. And they believe that they can do it. It's not too difficult for them, or too boring, or too easy for them. And in an environment characterized by a sense of security and connection to others. And this is how, according to self-determination theory, this satisfies humans' inherent need and consequently promotes learning and engagement. And these are the references, and thank you for your time.
Thank you very much, Ali. Thank you. Thank you very much for your inspirational talk. I was very moved, and then I think we all learned a lot. Thank you. Could you show yourself?
Yes.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you. So we have about 14 minutes until it was wonderful. So we have about 14 minutes until 7 o'clock p.m. here in Japan time. So if you have any questions, could you please raise your hand and then ask him some questions?